welcome to this session of the webinar series. The idea behind today's conversation is on the concept that we need to have a conversation on deprivation of liberty for people with disabilities, especially during the coronavirus pandemic. We all know the impact of coronavirus against people with disabilities, people with psychosocial disabilities, and we have known that this is quite an important conversation. On this particular webinar series, I have three extremely good presenters who are going to speak about these experiences from the United Kingdom, I think, but from a world perspective, so depending with where you are. We have another speaker who is going to speak about the rights of people with disabilities in institutions. I think now these are adults, and we are going to have another speaker who's going to speak about people with disabilities, but from a children's perspective. Now, the importance of torture or the impact of coronavirus against people with disabilities cannot be overestimated. Most recently, Validity Foundation with other organizations in Europe and in Africa, we have and we basically released a study which was trying to explain the impact of coronavirus against people with disabilities. And one of the things in which was coming out clearly was that people with disabilities, people with psychosocial disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities faced unprecedented kind of violation, be it not police brutality, be it not people with disabilities being subjected to violence or being subjected to institutions, taken to institutions without their own will, information being shared on about how to prevent coronavirus, but they were never considered. So all this conversation is quite important. That's why today I have three wonderful speakers. So for the purposes of introduction, I think we have now enough participants. My name is William Aseka. I'll be joining you, or I'll be moderating this session from Nairobi, Kenya, and I'm the Africa Advocacy Manager at Validity Foundation, which is organizing this series. I will be joined in this particular panelist with Dr. Dina Poursanidou. I don't know if I pronounced it right, but I think she'll be able to tell me that. So Dr. Dina has a background in psychology and has been a university-based social science researcher since 2010. Her research has spanned in a range of fields such as mental health, education, child health, youth justice, and social policy welfare. Her main research interests or expertise include depression in young people, sociology of mental health, critical approaches to patient and public involvement, known as PPI, in health and mental health research. She has an interest in service/user-led survivor research in mental health. And since 2010, she has been involved in mental health politics, and she's also a member of the Asylum Magazine editorial group, which is the radical mental health group, provides an open forum for critical reflection and debate for mental health issues. Since July 2017, she has also been a member of the UK National Survivor User Network, NSUN, and its survivor research on SRN. So Dr. Dina is going to begin our presentation, and she's going to give us her perspective, especially the challenges on how people with disabilities have been able to experience when they are deprived of their liberty on the basis of fighting corona. So if Dr. Dina, you could join us, and then we'll be able to proceed. Yes, Dr. Dina?
Okay, how do I look at my slides? Is it again through share screen?
Yes, you will need to share screen, and then so that we can be able to see your slides.
Okay, thank you. I'm a technophobe, you see, so I don't.
Yes, we can be able to see your screen now.
Okay, and do also a slideshow?
Yes, please. I think if you could just, yes, now it's
Yeah.
on the slideshow.
Okay.
Yes, so
Right.
Dr. Dina, please
Okay.
go ahead.
Thanks very much for inviting me to be part of this series. I need to add to the introduction of that William did for me that I'm also a mental health service user. So I'm a researcher, but also a mental health service user. So what I'll be talking about, deprivation of liberty and restrictive practices in adult inpatient mental health settings in England, are things that I have experienced myself a while back, but I also have personal, not just research experience. So I would like to offer some reflections and look at some emerging, and I'm stressing emerging trends, because obviously official government data we don't have yet about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on mental health service users and services. So now, under the deprivation of liberty and restrictive coercive practices, I would like to look at detentions under the Mental Health Act, physical restraints, and seclusions. And I understand that what I'm talking about is very context specific. It applies to England and Wales that are part of the UK. So I think it's important to give some definitions so we all know what I'm talking about. Now, somebody's detained under the Mental Health Act when they are being held compulsorily in hospital for assessment or medical treatment. And detention under the Mental Health Act is also known as sectioning. The criteria for detention is that somebody suffers from a mental disorder and they are a risk to themselves and to others. And there are different sections in the Mental Health Act under which people are detained according, and the sections define the duration and purpose of detention. Now, going on to physical restraint, one definition of physical restraint is that it's the physical restraint of a patient by one or more members of staff in response to aggressive behavior or resistance to treatment. This definition is not a definition I necessarily endorse, but this is a definition from an official body. Now, seclusion refers to the supervised confinement and isolation of a patient away from other patients in an area from which the patient is prevented from leaving. And this is really necessary in order to contain severe behavioral disturbance, which is likely to cause harm to others. Again, this is not a definition that I necessarily endorse, but that's from the Mental Health Act Code of Practice. I know that the organizers of the webinar are interested in torture, and looking at the UN definition against torture, Article 1, I understand that torture refers to intimidating and coercive treatment, inflicting severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, at the instigation of a public official. Now, the detentions under the Mental Health Act and also coercive, restrictive practices such as physical restraint and seclusion, in my personal and research experience, constitute intimidating and coercive treatment. So you can say that they constitute torture. I think in order to understand how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted on NHS mental health services in England, and particularly on deprivation of liberty for mental health service users, we need to look at the key characteristics of NHS mental health services in England when the pandemic broke out. So what was the state of NHS mental health services in England before COVID-19 broke out, or in the time leading to COVID-19 pandemic? So NHS mental health services in England were and are characterized by underfunding as a result of a 10-year austerity period, with vicious funding cuts to public services. Also, NHS mental health services in England are characterized by serious understaffing. There's been a significant loss of staff. For example, in 2017-18, 1/8 of the total mental health workforce was lost. People left. Something else that has characterized NHS mental health services in England is a sharp reduction in mental health beds. A 30% reduction in the number of beds occurred between 2009 and 2018. Also, other things, community mental health and crisis services have been decimated. For example, in Manchester, where I used to live, in 2012, there were 11 community mental health teams, and they shrunk to 6. There's an ongoing rise in the use of Mental Health Act to detain people. In other words, Mental Health Act detentions have been rising, have been increasing. Also, there is high prevalence of physical restraint, including face-down restraint in inpatient mental health settings, although the government has tried to advise the use of restraint only as a last resort. So all these things, I think, are showing that there has been an increased prevalence of coercion in NHS mental health services in England pre-COVID-19 pandemic. I just want to show you some anecdotal data from one mental health trust in England. First, I want to share some data from that refer to detentions in a section 136 suite. A section 136 suite is a ward where people are detained under the section 136 of Mental Health Act. What is section 136? If it appears to a police officer that one has a mental disorder and they need immediate care or control, the police officer can take them to a place of safety, usually a hospital, for assessment and treatment. And one can be kept under Section 136 up to 24 hours. Now, in this particular ward of that mental health trust in England, which I'm keeping anonymous, obviously, in January 2020, there were 44 people detained, 44 detentions. In March, when the national lockdown started, there were 41 detentions. Now, you can see that in June, July, August, numbers are jumping to 51, 60, and 60, and 60, respectively, detentions. So there seems to be an increase in detentions on that ward following March 2020, when the national lockdown started. Now, data from another ward from the same mental health trust, which is a psychiatric intensive care unit. Now, a psychiatric intensive care unit is a small, highly staffed unit that offers psychiatric intensive care for patients who are in an acutely disturbed phase of a serious mental disorder. That's from an official definition. So basically, PQs are small wards with a high patient-staff ratio, and people are acutely unwell. Looking at physical restraint incidents in this PQ from that mental health trust, we see that in January 2020, there were 3 incidents. March 2020, 8 incidents. When the national lockdown in England started, there were 8 incidents. But then in the months following March, June, July, August, the incidence of physical restraint jump. So we have June 17, July 29, August 10. So I imagine that I need to conclude here, and I can elaborate during the discussion. It seems that the COVID-19 pandemic may be exacerbating the already increased prevalence of coercion in NHS mental health services in England. The pandemic didn't create the increase, but it seems to be exacerbating it. And as I said, these are emerging trends, and the data are only from one trust. Now, I want to finish with a plug for Asylum. As William said, I am part of the editorial collective of Asylum magazine, which is the radical mental health magazine. You can find information on our website, www.asylummagazine.org, and on the left, or on the right, there is the front cover of our latest issue. I imagine I have to finish here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dina, for that presentation. Thank you for making presentation from an England perspective in terms of how the numbers have increased. So we already know this for sure, that the numbers of people deprived of liberty in institutions in England increased after the pandemic. And I think this, as I said, was in good perception, or in good, in line with the report which we recently released in terms of COVID-19 DRM monitor. So I think this is quite wonderful. In case you have any questions for Dr. Dina, what you'd be able to do is that we should have a Q&A session. towards the end of the process so that we can be able to have this conversation in detail. So thank you so much. My next speaker is Eric Rosenthal, who is the director of, is the founder and the executive director of Disability Rights International. Since establishing DRI in 1993, Mr. Rosenthal has trained human rights and disability rights activists and provided assistance to government and international development organizations worldwide. Rosenthal has conducted investigation and trained activists in more than 25 countries, and there are different reports about people with disabilities, especially in detention centers. So, Mr. Eric Rosenthal, please, if you could join us, will be wonderful. So, yes, I think you wanted to share your screen. I don't know if it's possible, or I can be able to do it for you.
Well, let me give a little introduction before I show the video. And first of all, by saying thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. It's such a pleasure to collaborate with Validity, which I consider a real sister organization to our own. We are, as an organization, doing a lot of work in the Americas, in Mexico and Guatemala. We've worked in 36 countries over the world, including Kenya, and 12 countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And the work that Validity has done in terms of documenting the abuses in institutions, exposing them, and taking legal action is so very complementary to our own work. That having an important ally like Validity really gives us strength, and we thank you for this collaboration. It is very important to have the opportunity to look at the relationship between detention and torture. And today, what I'd like to do is to talk about how children are implicated. There are many services which are viewed as voluntary. They are viewed as being in a child's best interests as a form of care and protection. And as a result, many people don't think that the abuses that happen in detention, that the torture that happens in detention happens to children. Indeed, when something is considered a community service or a family support service, all the protections that are associated with detention under the Convention Against Torture are often overlooked. And so what I'd like to do is to talk about some of our observations from the field, both in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Africa, about why it is that children are so at risk. We do have evidence from some scientific studies since COVID has begun, and those studies unfortunately were done in the United States, but they show that people in group homes, specifically in residential care, have a 5 times increased level of exposure and COVID infection, and a double the increased chance of death. So children are often overlooked because it is assumed that COVID is only about adults, but children and adults who are in residential care, who are in congregate facilities, and it makes sense when you think about it. Protection from COVID is about being able to isolate, to be independent, to have all the safety procedures that allow you to separate yourself off from the world. And when you put a child in a congregate setting and separate them from parents and family who will protect them, it is inevitable that they will be exposed, that they will have higher rates of sickness, death, and we're finding social isolation. So let's take a look briefly at the legal standards and see why this is so. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, did a report a few years back on children in detention and the protection against torture. And his finding was that evidence shows that children in detention have an increased level of torture, an increased level of violence, exploitation, and abuse over all other children. The Convention Against Torture is established. It is so incredibly important to protect any child or adult against torture that what it does is it sets up a series of protection mechanisms. It requires governments to ensure that there is not even a risk of torture, that you do not want to put any child or adult in a situation where they might be tortured. And so what's important to recognize, that the breakthrough of the Juan Mendez report is that if children in detention are going to have an increased risk of torture, that means that all social policies having to do with the placement of children are suddenly implicated, that the torture protection requires that you avoid unnecessary institutionalization. And that it's not just social policy, it's not just children's policy, but it's part of the protection against torture to make sure no child is in an institution who can be in a family. Now, the UN Disability Convention has taken a very strong stand. Article 19 says all people with disabilities have a right to live in the community with choices equal to others. And General Comment 5 has said that that means there is, for a child, the protection of the community means living in a family. And the definition of an institution, the places where children are at risk, is any place that is not a family. And that group homes or family-like environments can be just as dangerous as institutions. It doesn't matter whether it's a large institution, a small institution, a family-like institution, a group home, that is still a form of detention in an institution. And therefore, the placement of children in group homes puts them at higher risk of torture. And so it is not just a necessary and an obligation on states to implement the Disability Convention in protecting the right of children to grow up with a family. It is also, as part of the obligation to prevent torture, necessary to ensure that children are with families and are not exposed to that increased risk. And again, let me clarify, it's not saying that all placement of children in group homes is a form of torture. It's saying that there will be an increased risk, and therefore the Convention Against Torture requires that increased risk to avoid it. And therefore, what we do know about children is that when they're in the safety of a home, they are much more likely to be protected against violence, exploitation, abuse, the pain and suffering that constitutes torture, and now in the era of the pandemic, exposure to a potentially life-threatening illness. What does this mean in practice? Again, most people think group homes are nice, warm, safe places where children are brought to save them from the large evils of the orphanage and the institution. My organization, Disability Rights International, has done investigations all over the world. In Mexico and Guatemala recently, we just issued reports, and I encourage you to look at our website. We've described the situation in Mexico as a form of crime against humanity because the government is knowingly putting people at risk of torture and life-threatening circumstances in its vast institutional system. But what I'd like to address you now to is our findings in Bulgaria. It's part of Europe. It's a part of the world that receives European funding. The per capita support for reform in Bulgaria is probably higher than any place in the world. UNICEF and other international organizations that have worked on children have pointed to Bulgaria as the great success story. They've spoken about a 97% rate of deinstitutionalization. Orphanages have been closed down and children have been moved to what are called safe spaces that include group homes. Well, what my organization did, with the assistance of Validity and some of the fabulous activists on the ground in Bulgaria, is we went and looked at what's actually happening in those group homes. And what you are going to see from the video that I'm going to show, it's not a nice, safe, warm environment. It is a place that is clearly very dangerous. So to understand why this torture protection is so important, I think it's important to step inside and see what the life of a child is like inside one of the group homes that have been built with European money and with extensive technical assistance from some of the best children's organizations in the world. Now let's see if we can show this video. I'm going to try to share my screen. And if I can get to it. Is this coming up on everyone's screen? Are people able to see this? Nope, it's not working. I'm trying to share my screen, but it's not working. Okay. Why am I not able to share my screen? Let's see here. Share screen. Zoom seems to have not allowed me to share my screen.
And help, let me share it for you.
Okay, if you could do that. If you could go to the DRI website, I can talk you through how to get to this video. So DRI advocacy, if you could put on the screen driadvocacy.org, we can get to the video. It's posted on the DRI website.
Okay.
Thank you all for your patience. This is a very powerful video, and you'll.
Okay, so here I have it.
There we go. All right. Oh, that's great. I think you got it.
Yes. So can I play it?
Yep, you can play it.
Okay, sure.
This was released 1 year ago after an extensive investigation on group homes in.
This is a former baby home converted now to a day center and a group home.
A dead end for children, Bulgaria's group homes, is the product of an investigation by Disability Rights International onto the human rights of children and young people in Bulgaria's child care system. DRI visited 24 group homes, 5 day centers, 4 large institutions, 2 schools, and other programs for children with disabilities. This report finds that Bulgaria's child care reforms over the last decade have replaced a system of large orphanages with newer, smaller buildings that are still operating as institutions.
I mean, I don't know if it's a lack of digestion. My guess would be when she was born, she was just put in a crib and never moved.
This child is 22. This girl, it can prevent further disability. With attention and positioning and physical therapy, this child does not have to become like the one next door.
Inside Bulgaria's group homes, DRI investigators observed conditions that are strikingly similar to what DRI investigators observed in the institutions and orphanages the world over. Children sitting motionless in chairs, couches, or benches, or on concrete floors sitting in pervasive inactivity. Conditions are regimented and individualized care is lacking. Some children have shaved heads and such drab clothing, it is impossible to tell whether they are boys or girls. We observe children rocking back and forth, hitting themselves, biting their hands, or poking fingers in their eyes. These conditions are a product of long-term emotional neglect as children grow up without the love and care of a family. And as is common in institutions, children with little stimulation or positive role models develop behavioral problems and are more prone to violence and bullying of other children. Small children living with unrelated adolescents or adults are particularly at risk.
She bangs herself, she bangs the crib. We're told that there's no specific behavioral programs for that. It's just a lack of stimulation. So they can't watch him, so he has to be put in the little cage. He broke out, jumped out the window, so that's why they keep him in there.
The closure of Bulgaria's old orphanages was an enormous accomplishment that saved the lives of many children. But the new model of care, based on placement in group homes, is inadequate and will only lead to continued emotional damage and increased disabilities. The European Union has contributed to these problems by investing in buildings rather than families. The new UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities requires Bulgaria to protect the rights of all children to live and grow up with a family. DRI calls for an immediate moratorium on building new group homes. Urgent efforts should be made to protect families so no new admissions are needed. Every child should be in a family and not in an institution or group home. For more information, see www.driadvocacy.org.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for showing that. I will conclude my presentation here and hope we have a little opportunity for discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for that presentation, Eric. I think it was really informative that in this particular conversation, it's not just torture when we are looking at adults, okay? When we are looking at children, it also amounts to torture. And that was really powerful in terms of whatever it is that we have been able to find out, especially that some of these UN bodies or EU institutions keep on funding deprivation of liberty. So that is a conversation in which we need to continue having, especially calling out these bodies which keep on funding the existence of these group homes or institutions from whatever country it is, because our governments are not calling them out, so we need to be calling them out. So thank you so much for that presentation.
Thank you.
At this particular time, I'll want to introduce Priscila Rodríguez, who is going to speak about the same conversation, but with a little focus on adults with disabilities, okay? So Priscila Rodríguez, who has an LLM, is an associate director at the Disabilities Rights International, based in Washington, DC. Prior to this position, she was director of DRI in Mexico and Central American Regional Office from 2016 and 2017. And she was also the director of Women's Rights Initiative for the Americas from 2012 to 2017. She has also served as a human rights officer and mental health specialist for the United Nations High Commissions for Human Rights in 2017, and as an expert on sexual and reproductive rights and disability for the UN Population Fund. She's also, I think, as a faculty member of the International Disability Law Summer School at the National University of Ireland in Galway. So Priscila, I think if you could be able to share your screen so that we can be able to hear you. Welcome.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Validity, also for the invitation to participate in this webinar. A very important issue regarding torture against people with disabilities detained in institutions. As William mentioned, I work at Disability Rights International, or DRI, with Eric Rosenthal, and we've worked for several years specifically in Guatemala, where we've documented the situation of people with disabilities detained at particularly one psychiatric institution called the National Mental Health Hospital, also known as Federico Mora, the way I will refer to it from now on. I think it's interesting to start with quotes from people that either work at the institution or have been at the institution, just to show you the level of violence and abuse that people at this facility face. First of all, DRI started documenting the facility in 2011 after a tip-off regarding abuse and possible trafficking at the facility. This institution is in one of the most dangerous areas of Guatemala City. It's known for the presence of violent gangs, criminal gangs, and it's next to a prison, literally next door to a prison. And we've continued to receive reports that women with disabilities are allegedly taken to the prison next door and used for sexual purposes. Also, people from outside come into the facility. It's a very, very large, it's a facility that's in a very large area. So there are a lot of green areas where it's easy for abuse to take place. There is actually one of the quotes here is that from one psychiatrist resident at Federico Mora, who told us that he sees a rape every day at the facility. It's been named as the most dangerous hospital in the world by a BBC documentary published in 2014. Psychiatrists at the Federico Mora also told us that given the level of violence at the institution, it is impossible to provide any type of meaningful care at the facility. Psychiatrists have also repeatedly sent judges reports asking them to stop sending people to the institution, but also to release people from the institution. Many times judges send people to these institutions who are homeless or who have no supports because Guatemala has failed to create any types of alternatives in the community. So the only alternative, the only option right now is this psychiatric institution. And judges send people there. And psychiatrists often tell judges that leaving people at the Federico Mora is in detriment to their physical and mental health. In also 2014, a multidisciplinary team at the Federico Mora, together with a DRI expert, evaluated patient by patient and determined that 75% of the population could leave today if they had somewhere to go. That is 3 in 4 could leave today if they had a place to live, and also access to food just for everyday survival. But there is no medical reason for them to be there. The other 25 could still live, but they would need more support. Still, there is no reason for them to be detained at the Federico Mora. The government would just need to work harder to provide more supports to the 25%. But for the 75%, the government they need to create housing options in the community where these people could live, where they could have, so that they could be reintegrated into the community. Despite this, after 10 years, almost 10 years of documenting the abuses at this facility, the government has failed to do so, leaving people at risk, at severe risk. When we first started documenting this facility, one of the staff told Eric that we saw a 16-year-old in an isolation room, and the staff said that they lock him up to protect him from being raped. So it's just one of the most horrible institutions, and yet every institution is dangerous. Every institution for any person, and especially for children, as Eric was mentioning, is inherently dangerous place for people where they are likely to be abused, subjected to torture, detained indefinitely, and left in inhumane and degrading conditions, as some of the findings at this facility show. As I had already mentioned, people are segregated because the state has failed to provide alternatives in the community. There is no reason for these people to be segregated, except that they have nowhere else to go. There is no medical reason. These are social reasons, and the state is still continuing to fail to create these supports that are mandated under international standards. They are also subjected to isolation rooms, put in isolation, and also under restraints for a prolonged period of time, which the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, former UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, already determined that it was that could amount to torture. Deaths are not reported or investigated. This year, before the pandemic started, we heard harrowing accounts of deaths, a body being found on a barrel of water, somebody being shot from the prison next door as they tried to escape. Several instances of deaths just this year, but also for decades, and these are not reported nor investigated. There is no public accountability on or public reporting on how many deaths have happened at the facility every year and what is the reason behind them. There is physical and sexual abuse and rape, as I had already mentioned. There are women who are getting pregnant as a result of rape, and the babies are being removed. We know this year only alone, 2 women got pregnant. One of the babies died before being born, and the other one was removed from the mother as soon as the baby was born and put under the custody of the state, which of course leaves this baby at risk of a lifetime of institutionalization and abuse as well. People are being arbitrarily detained, as the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has stated. Detaining a person on the basis of a disability is arbitrary, constitutes arbitrary detention, and these people are being arbitrarily detained based on their disability. There is lack of any meaningful treatment and rehabilitation. People are left languishing in the concrete floors of the institution or in puddles of their own urine in mattresses. All of this amounts to inhumane, unhygienic, and degrading conditions, which are particularly dangerous right now in the context of the pandemic. Just a brief summary of what has happened since the pandemic started. As of August 2020, the government reported that half of the people with disabilities detained at the institution have tested positive. There are around 330 people, or there were around 330 people, and about 160 tested positive, but it is not clear if everyone was tested and if this number would be higher if everybody was tested. According to the government, at least 3 people have died. However, there are 31 people that are unaccounted for. In March 2020, before the pandemic started, the government reported that there were about 321 patients at the facility, and in August, the government said that there were 290. What happened to those 31? The government is not giving is not accounting for them, and it's not clear if they have died and if the government is not publishing those deaths as related to COVID-19 or if they have been dumped out of the institution. We don't know. Staff has also tested positive and complains about the lack of personal protective equipment, and also worries that if there are more positive cases in staff, these people will be subjected to even more neglect as staff numbers decrease. Staff is also worried about the second wave of infections, which is imminent, as we have seen around the world, but also in Guatemala. All of this, it just shows that it's impossible to provide adequate treatment in degrading conditions that prevail at the facility. What have we done? What has DRI done to challenge the abuses happening at the institution? Well, in 2010, we requested the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to order the state to take urgent measures to protect the people, which the commission agreed to. They issued what is called precautionary measures and called on the government to take urgent steps to protect the life and the right not to be tortured for the people with disabilities detained at the institution. Given the failure of the government to do so, in 2014, we filed a case against the Guatemalan state, which we are still in the process of litigating, and hopefully will reach the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. This case has a focus on the fact that the only way to protect people and to guarantee their rights is to reintegrate them to the community. So it could be a very important regional precedent in terms of the right of people with disabilities in institutions to be integrated in the community. In the context of the pandemic, we've appealed to the Special Rapporteur on Disability, which at the time was Catalina de Bandas, and she sent a letter to the state, also highlighting the fact that people with disabilities have the right to live in the community, and segregating them not only exposes them to deadly risks, such as what the pandemic has shown, but also it's in violation of their rights. We have also requested the Commission to, it's a process of extending the precautionary measures. That means to order the state to take further action now in the context of the pandemic to protect the people. And then we also have had several events and a regional hearing on emergency deinstitutionalization before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and also some webinars, very important webinars with Validity and other allies. As I had already mentioned, the rights being violated. I mean, people with disabilities detained at the Federico Mora are being systemically abused, and their rights are being violated. And some of these rights or actually all of these rights are recognized by the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and they include the right to community integration, to no discrimination, not to be arbitrarily deprived of liberty, not to be subjected to torture and inhumane and degrading treatment, and to receive treatment, adequate treatment and rehabilitation. In relation to the right of no discrimination, the others I've already spoken about, but I just want to say that in relation to the right to no discrimination, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has also determined that institutionalization on the basis of disability is not only arbitrary, but also a form of discrimination. That's because a person without a disability is not segregated indefinitely and abused just to be able to receive treatment, while people with disabilities are. So that's why this is based on a precedent by the US Supreme Court in a case called Olmsted. It's an important precedent, and it's important to highlight that it is a form of discrimination also, the institutionalization of people with disabilities. On the left, I've put the articles that are being violated of the CRPD, of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, if you are interested. Obviously also the right to life, the right to a family. The institutionalization basically violates every right of a person, because a person who is an institution cannot start a family, cannot go to school, cannot work, etc. I'll just leave a few issues for discussion. Some of them I've already spoken about in my presentation, and some of them we can possibly address them in the question and answer time. And some of them have already also been addressed by my fellow speakers, Eric and Dina. First of all, there is an urgent need to get people out of institutions as the only way to protect them and to guarantee the rights under the CRPD, particularly the rights to be free from torture, as shown in the case of the Federico Mora. It is impossible to fix institutions, especially such abusive ones as Federico Mora. Resources should not be poured into institutions to try to fix them. Instead, the state has an obligation to use resources to create alternatives and to get people out. Institutionalization is a grave and systemic form of abuse that may in itself constitute torture. And why is it a grave and systemic form of abuse? Just because of what I've shown in the previous slide. Institutionalization, the institutionalization of people with disabilities violates every single, it's bound to violate every single one of their rights, and leaves them vulnerable to abuse and grave abuse that also may amount to torture. I know I think I've run out of time, or I know William may want to take some questions from the participants, so I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Priscila, for the presentation. I think on the ideas about torture in relation to adults with disabilities. I think this was a wonderful connection. So I think, guys, those of you who have questions, we are now at this is the moment. So I want to open it up for discussions, but just to wrap it up so that you can be able to understand what it is, the discussion that we're doing today. Our discussions today was to ensure that we are able to see whether we can be able to expand the concept or to expand the definition of torture or ill treatment, which will include people with disability, with a specific focus of the pandemic. Now, Dr. Dina was able to explain to us that we have had increase of people with disabilities in institutions, so they've been deprived of their liberty. And we have also had the same kind of conversation on children with disability when Mr. Eric was able to speak about it. And now Priscila's been able to wrap it up by trying to give a perspective in Guatemala, whereby we are seeing that people with disabilities being deprived of their liberties in prison, and it ends up having to be an ill treatment, inhumane treatment, or which might amount to torture. So in case you have a question, if you cannot be able to speak, you can be able to type it on the chat box. I'll be able to pick it up. If you can be able to raise your hand, I should be able to see you raise your hand. There's a raise hand button feature on the right. I think I cannot be able to see my screen. Yes, and right now I see Mr. Wakene. I think, yes, you could be able to speak. Yeah. And then we'll be able to go to Paul. Yes, Wakene. You are muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I had to unmute my mic. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you, moderator, and thank you, the presenters, for this insightful presentations. Regarding Eric's presentation and that video you showed us, there is a conclusion, which was later reinforced by the moderator as well, that donors of some of the mega donors are contributing to these rights violations through institutions. Now, my question regarding that is, has anybody, such as the DRI, for example, revealed this adverse effect of the donors' contributions in terms of institutionalization, and communicated this to the donors themselves? If so, what was their response like? And do they have any monitoring mechanism, as any donor, any funder has, to see what is happening as a result of their funding contributions in terms of rights violations? Have you had a chance to explore these things? Was there any monitoring done by the donors? And was there any communication from the CSOs, the DPOs, and organizations like DRI to the donors? And what was the response afterwards? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. That was a great question. If I could respond, you hit the nail on the head. These abuses are unfortunately being perpetuated by international funding that is helping and assisting countries develop group homes as an alternative to orphanages and institutions. DRI's report, which was covered by BBC and we've tried to bring to international attention, was very much directed at educating international donors about the importance of ensuring that children live in a family and not in a group home, that these supposedly residential facilities are neither humane nor safe. I know that Validity has also done excellent work in this area, and together we've brought this to the European Union, which is one of the major funders of group homes in Europe. And so we are doing advocacy alongside other groups to try to get the European Union to stop funding group homes. There is a battle, a raging battle on the international stage right now as to whether or not group home placements are safe or frankly legal under international law. The disability community, the CRPD committee, has been very clear that it is a form of institutionalization and is a violation of human rights law. Unfortunately, standards that are widely accepted in the children's community, such as the UN Guidelines in Alternative Care, say that institutions should be replaced by residential facilities. And UNICEF is a big backer of the UN Guidelines in Alternative Care. The children's donors have followed the lead of UNICEF. While they accept that children are better off with the families and group homes are viewed as the exception to the rule, what our report finds is that even if you create a small exception for placement for children, if there's, it's a last resort, if it's necessary, all these terms for a short time as a transition, it's not a transition. If there are no community supports for children, you can create a group home and you can say it's a transition to the community. You can say it's temporary, but until you make the investments in ensuring that families can keep their children, it's not temporary. And that's why we called our report a dead end for children. I believe that UNICEF really needs to be held accountable. And it's very important for the disability community to realize that some of the standards, such as the UN guidelines on alternative care, and the position that has been taken by UNICEF are in fact contrary to General Comment 5 and the right of all children to live in the community, which means a family and not a group home. We need to get the voice of the disability community loud. UNICEF needs to hear it. The Committee on the Rights of the Child needs to hear it, because frankly, the donors are going to continue to fund group homes as long as it's legal under these children's rights standards. So there's a conflict right now. It's not legal under the CRPD, but it is legal under the UN guidelines on alternative care. We must improve international standards. We must harmonize international standards, because the money will continue to flow and perpetuate these abuses unless the standards are clarified. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, and I think just to add on that particular conversation by Eric, I think the European Network of Independent Living with Validity are actually currently suing the European Union for funds which are being misused or supporting segregation of people with disabilities in Poland. So that is something in which is currently ongoing. At the same time, sometime early this year, I think the UN found Hungary, where our organization is located, to have actually violated the rights of people with disabilities when it funded institutions which were going to lead to violations of people with disabilities. And I think just to wrap it up, I think majority of that conversation has been in Europe. What we are currently doing in Africa, we are actually interested to see which donors are actually funding projects which in one way or another are not CRPD standard. So this is a conversation in which we are interested in, so that we can be able to make and ensure that we call out donors and we call out governments who keep on one hand, they have signed and ratified the CRPD, but on the other hand, they keep on receiving funds which at the end of the day lead to institutionalization for people with disabilities. It leads to rights violation for people with disabilities, whether in institutions or even outside the institution. So I can be able to see Paul Mugambi, your hand was up. I don't know if you are still there. Paul? Paul? Are you able to speak? Can you unmute? So in case you have any other question, I think, okay, yes, Paul.
Thank you very much for this webinar. My name is Paul Mugambi. I'm a blind public.
Paul, would you mind to speak up?
Inclusion expert.
Paul, would you mind to speak up?
Yeah.
Speak up so that our sign language interpreter can hear you for interpretation. Hello? Okay. Oh, I don't know. So anyway, I think, do you guys have any other question? Paul?
Could I add another couple of thoughts until others come up with questions? I just wanted to add that while our Bulgaria report focuses on the situation in Europe, we have done work in Kenya, Guatemala, Peru, Argentina, Brazil. What we find is that this process that was initiated in Europe is now being exported to other countries. In Kenya, there's many facilities that are small 20-bed facilities. If I recall correctly from our work in Kenya, if a facility has less than 20 children, it's not regulated as an orphanage. And therefore there's an explosion. There are many uncounted children in places that are not even considered orphanages or institutions. So there's an invisible problem of group homes in places like Kenya. The same is true in Guatemala. Our organization publicized the horrible abuses of the Hogar Seguro 600-bed orphanage in the country, where there was a fire, where they were trafficking women. What happened when that facility was closed? The international community came in and they built group homes. They built small facilities. The children were saved from the big 600-bed orphanage where they were trafficked and exposed to a fire which burned 41 children. And then they were moved where? To group homes. So the problem is not just a European problem. The problem is expanding to many other parts of the world. We have seen these group homes everywhere. And again, it is why it's important to have clear international standards, because the money is flowing. No effort has been made to count the number of children in group homes, because the international community doesn't consider them institutions. There may be many millions of children in institutions who are going uncounted and who are exposed to these abuses. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a question for Dina on the chat box, which I'll read, I think, in a moment. But I can see Jen Buchaman, you have your hand up. Jen? Jen, are you able to speak? You can unmute.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Buchanan with the Disability Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. It's been really compelling and interesting to listen to this webinar. And I had a question, I guess, for DRI colleagues. And I know this was mentioned on another great Validity and DRI and other organizations webinar recently. So the efforts to promote emergency deinstitutionalization during COVID. And I was wondering if there's any examples where you've seen that being done successfully already, you know, even small examples. I'd be really interested for your experience or expertise with that. Thank you.
Excuse me, it's one of the sign language interpreters here. Can you speak up, please? Or moderator, can you repeat the question? Thank you.
Okay, Jen, I think, would you mind to speak up a little bit so that the sign language can be able to interpret? Yes,
yes, I'm sorry. So the question, can you hear me better now?
Is it better?
Okay, great, thank you. So the question is, does DRI or anyone else have good examples of emergency deinstitutionalization during COVID?
Yes, I don't want to be the only person to speak here, so I'll be very brief. Again, in an emergency situation, it's always hard to get documentation. And this is clearly the exception that proves the rule that people are still being abandoned to institutions. But there is litigation in the United States. The Center for Public Representation, based in Massachusetts, has done litigation in a case in Connecticut where they got a court order which at least requires no new admissions and a very intense standard for review that requires immediate efforts to get people out of the facility. So, you know, when we use the term emergency deinstitutionalization, we are under no illusion that it is possible to simply close institutions overnight. When we say emergency institution, we are very careful to warn against dumping. because it's the easiest thing in the world for say, okay, you don't like institutions, we'll just dump people on the streets. And that's what's happening in Guatemala right now, where we're saying people are at risk in this institution, you need to bring them to safety in the community. And the government is saying, okay, you don't like it? Well, we lock these people up all their lives, but now that it's no longer convenient, we'll simply dump them out onto the streets. That is not what we're calling for. We are calling for safe, careful, but urgent and immediate efforts. So that case by the Center for Public Representation gives an example about how no new admissions policies can be adopted and more active reviews so that, you know, immediate efforts can be made. The resources don't go into building the better institution. The resources, perhaps even on an individual level, are wrapped around the individual to allow them to stay in the community. And I think that that is a cutting edge model that could be reproduced around the world. Thank you.
Okay. So Dina, you have two questions here. I think to number one, your question is, why do you think the numbers have been rising in mental health units in the United Kingdom, and why do you suspect there are higher levels of coercion during the pandemic? And then there's also another question from Sonia Soans. The question is, can you please tell us a bit more on the new psychiatric hospital that is opening in Manchester, especially in light of the austerity and COVID? Yes, so yeah, so I think if you could be able to respond to those two, and then we can be able to move forward. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have time to actually offer any reflections on why there seems to be some trends, at least, of increased coercion and detentions, possibly in mental health settings, you know, following the breakout of the pandemic. I mean, my thinking is that there's an interesting idea of the COVID-19 pandemic as a mass trauma. So, you know, people are experiencing increased uncertainty, hopelessness, helplessness. People who are already mental health service users, they might be experiencing intense anxieties around contamination. So if they have, for example, unusual beliefs about contamination from others or contaminating others, I mean, these sort of anxieties are likely to be exacerbated. So on the one hand, we may have higher levels of anxiety, powerlessness, distress. On the other hand, we have community mental health and crisis services being stripped down in England. For example, as I said, these services were already stretched well before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, the staff has been even more reduced because people may be off sick, or they may be self-isolating. Now, working has moved to remote working, and a lot of people, particularly perhaps people who live with existing mental health problems, don't want to engage or can't engage with telephone appointments as well as they could engage perhaps with face-to-face appointments. So this early preventative support that the, you know, decent community mental health services could provide is not there. So I think the combination of the two, perhaps people being increasingly distressed, as I said, COVID-19 as a mass trauma, plus reduced response from services, may mean that when people reach services are very unwell, they have reached crisis point, and then they are more likely to be detained because they are considered as a threat to themselves or to others. So these are my thoughts that could explain why there may be increased detentions. Now, in terms of Sonia's question, I don't know very much about the new psychiatric hospital in Manchester. All I know is that the old hospital where I was detained as well 10 years ago, 11 years ago, Park House, I don't know whether they're knocking it down or they are refurbishing it, or what I know though is that there used to be an office where the Manchester Users Network, they were using this space for their meetings. Apparently they've lost this space. I don't know to what extent this is linked to refurbishment or the new hospital. So I can try and find out more about it. Or if you want more information, I think the Manchester Users Network would be able to give you more information about the hospital, the new hospital.
Okay, thank you. I can see Paul still has his hand up. Maybe if you can now be able to speak, unmute yourself and speak louder kindly. You can unmute, Paul. Okay, I think we seem to be having a technical issue. So, Paul, once again. Okay, so I think maybe just to add on this particular conversation, one of the things in which we also need to note is that I think Eric tried to define what emergency institutionalization is. And I think also one of the points in which Priscila was speaking about touched on emergency institutionalization. I think my colleague Zofia has been able to paste the next webinar, which will be emergency institutionalization. So that conversation will be able to go there in detail, and we should be able to have the questions about emergency institutionalizations in detail. So at this particular time, I think unless there are any other burning questions, I'd really like to thank our participants and our panelists for taking their time. I know Eric and Priscila are in the US where it's election day, so they need to go out and ensure that they vote for their candidate so that we can be able to move forward. So at this particular time, please accept our sincere thanking from Validity. On behalf of Validity, I'd like to thank every participant for joining us, and I'd like the panelists to thank you all for attending, also for taking the time and attending us. So thank you so much. We should be able to meet again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.